by the end of 2001, when Seagram went out of beverage alcohol business and our brand was sold, and we realized Seagram had a blend of whiskey which had nothing to do with our Kentucky bourbon. But relative to this bottle right here, the blended whiskey looked very similar to it. It was a cheap, inexpensive bottom shelf blended whiskey which had destroyed the renowned name that's just once had in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, when this was actually the #1 selling bourbon in the U.S. Seagram pulled us off the domestic market to focus on the blends back at the end of the 50s. And our bourbon disappeared from the U.S. At the end of, by the 1960s, our bourbon was gone. So when the renowned name that this once had in the industry had been reduced to really as low levels you could get in our, I think, in our industry.
Sure.
Like I said, it wasn't a Kentucky bourbon, had nothing to do with us, but Seagram owned the brand, and it was a blended whiskey made originally in Indiana and Maryland, and when Seagram closed the Maryland distillery in the mid-80s, it was all being made in Indiana. And so when Seagram went out of business, we stopped production, sales, we recalled as much as blended whiskey, began to make plans to bring our bourbon back to the U.S., but we knew we couldn't focus on this bottle because of the relative appearance to the blended whiskey brand. So we introduced our single barrel bourbon in September 2004. Took us 2 years to become the #1 selling. By late 2006, it was already become the #1 selling single barrel bourbon in Kentucky. And that's the year we introduced our small batch bourbon, September 2006. And our single barrel actually won so many awards. I was really hesitant about tasting, having seminars, whatever, with the two side by side. I said, oh, gosh, because the single barrel had won, right out the gate, it won Whiskey Magazine's, probably the largest trade publication in the world.
Sure.
Not the largest.
Associated with whiskey for sure, absolutely.
And our single barrel won the best American whiskey 4 months, 5 months out after being introduced as best American whiskey under 10 years from the U.S. And it won awards like that every year, won several other different prestigious awards, including a Taste of the Bluegrass, Kentucky's largest tasting event. And so I said, boy, we spent over a year from bottle design, trying to get something that would catch note with the embossed roses in the middle of the label. And we distill and age separately 10 recipes. This uses 4 recipes, our small batch. And of the 4 recipes, it will take us 17 to 18 barrels to hit as close as we can our flavor profile for a small batch.
And that's what's amazing to me about the small batch is it truly does fit perfectly into this slot created between the yellow label, this product here, and the single barrel. I think you're getting a nice
absolutely.
Step
it just absolutely worked perfectly. And when we did start doing tastes, people began to ask for them, and side by side, you're never too old to learn something new, something different. But every person that would try it, every other person, it's so close to 50-50.
Yeah.
It would be hard to call. One person would like single barrel, one person would like the small batch. Now, because we are so unique with 10 recipes, we use 4 recipes here, but the recipe we use for single barrel is not one of these 4.
Okay,
They're totally different. They don't taste anything alike.
And you mentioned earlier for the single barrel, spending some time today doing the barrel selection earlier today, getting a sense of at least 5 of those barrels with the V designation. V being the yeast strain that contributes greatly to that light fruitiness that you're putting out there with the single barrel. You have you're sort of creating or slotting in these flavor profiles as you go up maybe through this chain. The yellow label being maybe more of 10, 12, 14 different.
We use all 10 of our recipes with a target formula, which is why we started the 10 recipes, because we always looked at quality as a conformance to standard. If we know what we want this to taste like, how do you do it time after time? No 2 barrels are ever like. Every barrel we have about 380,000 barrels in inventory. No 2 barrels alike. A giant like Jim Beam has 1.5 million or more. No two barrels alike.
Yeah.
So how do you achieve consistency from bottling run to bottling run? So we started 10 recipes, target formula. When we come around to another bottling run, we will sample the barrels. We would tweak the formula a little more one, less of another, more H here, less here. We'll tweak the formula to achieve the flavor profile
Gotcha.
exactly like it was.
Yep.
That was a theory. It still can't be done. So
Understood,
this may be
yeah.
the most consistent, but it still can't be done.
There's
This is
always
many
going to be
years
some
ago.
variance.
Always going to be a difference.
Okay.
The plus side of making this type of efforts, because of the quality efforts we were making, is when the industry came around to single barrel bourbons, small batch bourbons, we could do something no one else could.
Absolutely.
We have every label that you ever see on a Four Roses bottle is going to be different by formula design. It's not just because it's going to have more or less age or different strength or age in this warehouse versus this one. It's going to be different by formula design.
Absolutely.
So we use two grain recipes. We use 50% of each for this.
Okay.
And then we use a yeast with each of the recipes. We use a yeast 70% roughly that generates a spiciness. And then we use a second yeast at 30% with each recipe that generates more of a rich, full-bodied fruity flavor versus the V yeast, the light and delicate fruitiness that we use with our single barrel. So we use 50% of each with two different yeasts than we use in the single barrel, and it's totally different.
Now, you have sort of this maybe this game plan in mind that you're looking for. Maybe it's a house style, or maybe it's in your mind sort of how you want this product, these distinct products to taste. For me, when I taste Four Roses, I think balance. I think they're all, levels of spice, levels of fruit, levels of sweetness, levels of oak, but everything seems to be in relative harmony. That may be wrong, but what?
Oh, I agree. That's the goal.
Okay.
And you'll always hear us talk about forever mellow.
Yes.
And the mellowness of the Four Roses bourbon brands is, I don't think it just can't be touched. And that begins with the selection of the grains. We've been using the same farmers, the same corn source. We're in our 51st year. We pay a premium to get the best of the crops rather than negotiating a lower price because of the volume of bushels of grain we're buying. We want the best of the best. Not we're looking at it from different perspectives.
Sure.
And then we source rye grain. We use more rye than any other bourbon by far. There are two grain recipes, one 75% corn, 20% rye, and 5% malted barley, which is used in both of our recipes. 20% rye is more small flavoring grain than any other bourbon. And all bourbons will use, it's generally rye, sometimes wheat, like Makers uses wheat, very successful.
Yeah.
And then our other recipe is 60% corn, 35% rye. So we get a lot of spice from the rye. We turned off.
No, we're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have a lot of spice from the rye. But we have the 5 yeast, and we have, like our V yeast we use with our regular single barrel. We use our mash bill with the high rye, 35% rye, only 60% corn. But then we balance that out with a yeast that generates this very light, very delicate fruitiness.
Absolutely. And that really comes across for sure.
Absolutely. And we have some very successful limited edition single barrels that we've used our K yeast, which generates spiciness. Now we use 70% of the K yeast, the spicy yeast we call it, in this. Now, even though we have 50% of each of the mash bills, so this ends up with 27.5% rye grain. Probably more often than not, most people that try them side by side will think this has more rye than the 35% rye.
Yes. I think that
mash bill.
it seems that way.
That's the impact of the yeast.
Absolutely.
Yeast is very important.
To
People
me,
usually don't talk
that's
about
amazing.
it.
That's amazing because what the small batch comes across to me at is being drier, having more of that dry spice flavor that you expect to get. So it's interesting that it may, in essence, when you add them all together, have less rye grain, but because of the yeast.
Because of the yeast, and that's not talked about very often because most distilleries, I don't think anybody has more than one proprietary yeast culture. We have 5.
Yep.
So we have the V, well, our code's V yeast, the light and delicate fruitiness, the K, the spicy yeast. Then we have the O yeast, more of a rich, full-bodied fruity flavor. And then we have two very interesting yeasts. One is our Q, which generates a floral essence, and then our F, which will generate an herbal essence. And this year's single barrel, limited edition single barrel that we'll introduce in a couple months or so, we've used finally selected it just recently.
Okay.
It's a Q yeast.
All right.
In combination with the high rye mash bill, the B mash bill with the 35% rye. And I remember when I first looked at the samples, first thing that popped out, literally took it to my nose, sample, and I smelled roses.
Wow.
With the Q yeast. Now we had one of my favorite limited edition single barrels was the 2009, and we used a Q yeast, but with the other mash bill. And when I sat down and a string of samples in front of me, I picked that up and said, wow, this is absolutely unbelievable. I felt like I was surrounded by honeysuckle.
Man.
Like, so when I say Q's and floral essence,
yep.
It's not always honeysuckle, it's not always roses, it could be any
exactly
type of
that
flower.
floral note that you're getting from
yeah. But this time it's just amazing because the roses, just like a bouquet of roses, just jumped out of the glass when I smelled it, and it's going to be really.
When
really,
do you expect? You said September. Is that typically when?
No, that's our limited edition single barrel should be out in April, right?
All right.
Right close.
Everybody take note of that. That's going to be a